May I have your attention? Appropriate, given I'm about to talk on stage. It's easy to turn your focus to me, illuminated on a pedestal. But how frequently do we truly own our attention? How and when do we attend to the things that aren't lit up and flattened, on screen or on stage? For most of human history, we were the masters of visually scaling in and out. Following the tracks of an animal, scanning for danger, and intimately learning the plants and waterways around us was a way of life. Our modern needs and conveniences aren't the same as in the past. Today, we're exposed to more information than ever in history, and we're struggling to adapt. I am an artist and a naturalist. I've also moved around all my life, from immigrating to jumping back and forth between California and New York, to traveling independently from the age of 15. Throughout these travels, the deep interconnection between these two fields has taught me to wield my attention as a tool for seeing beyond borders and weaving complex stories before it's too late. In 2020, my home country, Belarus, was suddenly racked by serious political upheaval. My family in Europe fled, scattered across the continent, further displaced by the later war in Ukraine. Returning was off the table, so where was home? These were changes that rippled out everywhere, but that I couldn't process in my senses. I translated prison reports with my mother and raised money to aid refugees like my family members, but it was completely overwhelming. That same year, my aunt's home in the Big Basin Redwoods, where I grew up, burned to the ground in the Santa Cruz lightning fires. With COVID raging and no lease back in New York, my mother, sister, and I lived in the forest out of a rented SUV, with the fires following us at every turn. After seeing those flames firsthand, and in the wake of these losses, I began to seriously reflect on the nature of my relationship to place and environment. Why did it take catastrophe for me to really look at them? And my memories of adversity was evolution, however. I could see that in the drawings I made of the towering redwoods, uniquely evolved to survive wildfire. I could feel that in my knowledge of foraging for plants and mushrooms with my grandmother. I could see that in the paintings I made of the post-Soviet dachas. And in them, I could see that the human hand that was wounding them could instead be my hand, proposing to rebuild, building a record of remembrance. Over the course of the past 7 years, I've been to 21 states and 33 countries. From riding to Alaska on a motorcycle with my partner to backpacking in the Sinai Desert, home was everywhere. And for all of us, home needs to be everywhere. Because disaster is cumulative and exponential. War and fire does not leave people hundreds of miles away from it exempt, because nothing exists in isolation, and nature knows this best. As I hitchhiked, slept on beaches and in abandoned buildings, and carried everything on my back, I made hundreds of paintings outdoors, on plein air. And plein air can be inconvenient, uncomfortable, but it always requires lots of that fleeting and magical thing, my attention. Having struggled up a massive sand dune on the North Sea, I would be faced with lashing winds, but learn while painting that the same shoreline I was so exposed upon was a safe haven for the insects, frogs, and birds living in the grass. In Montana, I painted in the middle of fire season, digging backcountry trails on exposed ridges, learning how the pioneer plant fireweed revegetates disturbed soil. In Vermont, I painted in the middle of a blizzard, learning how the deer bed down in the thicket to keep warm despite sub-zero temperatures. Plein air is one vital way in which I've learned to truly love land, even when, and sometimes especially when, it's hostile, dangerous, or desolate. The fierce desert, teeming with nocturnal life, the vast glaciated ice field, slowly sending pure water to the valley below it. The practice encourages me not to shy away, but rather engage closer. When else would I be able to see, hear, smell everything around me? When else would I be able to learn what I could notice if I just stayed still? We're surrounded by reductions of nature. If it isn't the flattened backdrop to a natural history exhibit, it's the blueprint for a site of potential alteration. In turn, headlines and updated photographs are sometimes only able to convey that a number of hectares are no more, that the borders of the map must be changed. We must look at this closely, but recognize that when it becomes too much, we can't help but cope by distracting ourselves or by imagining that problems are only immediately relevant when they concern us directly, when the flames have finally arrived at our doorstep. But nature is powerful and resilient, and sometimes it's possible to see those traits best in the slow work of greater cycles: soil, vegetation, patterns in weather, that which we so readily overlook. Sometimes conservation necessitates certain degrees of destruction. Indigenous ecological practices, like controlled burning and hunting, for example, were ways of life that also kept ecosystems healthy. People already know how to mitigate the fire that's been lit. They just aren't being listened to. The trouble is, when most of us can't even see the nature around us, we have no idea how to interact with or care for it. Unless we go out of our way to pay attention, our connection to these landscapes is severed. And as they slowly, gradually disappear, we don't even notice until they're gone. This is part of the reason why the gravity of ecological and humanitarian crises is so difficult to convey. How can we possibly emotionally relate to a graph that tells us in numbers how broken the world is? We have many lessons to relearn because people cannot be separated from landscape. Ecological crises are humanitarian crises, and everything begins and ends with the land. Backpacking in Denali National Park, where there are no trails, a little USGS map is sold with your backcountry permit. In the field, I soon realized that looking outside it and reading the land can be far more important. As my partner and I came over the gravel bar of the East Hooklot River, struggling through the dense tundra moss, it became apparent that the only way to go was up. With a storm on our tail, surrounded by prime grizzly territory, and yet to find camp for the night, we scrambled to the spine of a mountain to get a bird's eye view. Suddenly, a little path revealed itself, barely 5 inches in width, winding behind the shoulder of the mountain where the wind quieted. Gradually leading to a distant lake and abundant with berries, it was clearly a favorite route for a herd of caribou. And after a few miles, they emerged. As they stared, gauging whether or not we were a threat, I came to realize how acutely grateful I was to them. We were sharing invaluable resources: space, knowledge, and attention. They taught me a different kind of intelligence. I could learn how to navigate this incredibly fragile and difficult landscape from the ones who knew it best simply by reading deeply into my environment. And the more I regarded everything around me as an equal standing to myself, the more I was encouraged to notice how the ecosystems I found myself in were complex worlds, simultaneously destructive and restorative, fragile and resilient. The divisions we're surrounded by, like highways, fences, national borders, can pose far more devastating consequences than we know. And again, I think of Belarus, where a 116-mile-long fence is cutting apart the Belaverskaya Pusha, one of the last old-growth forests in Europe, to deter migrants fleeing Belarus for Poland. The harm this is causing to living beings, their access to food, water, safety, and the right to movement is enormous and visible. By someone seeking refuge, by an animal trapped in that cage. I painted in abandoned hospitals in New York, marveling at the new ways in which people and animals came to use spaces previously fenced off with barbed wire. During the hottest summer on record, I painted at an abandoned naval base in Albania, witnessing the dozens of species of birds that followed their migratory pathways despite the brutal heat. And these experiences are important to me, even if they're less picturesque. Because despite these divisions, despite these boundaries, life was persevering and adapting to changes that I had a responsibility for. And painting these scenes was a way for me to record, care for, and feel present within my surroundings. What if we could surpass these boundaries? Forming personal and meaningful relationships with the landscapes around us, even if they aren't pretty, even if they aren't our home, is integral. We have no choice but to look closely. As artists, thinkers, but firstly as people with a responsibility for our home and someone else's home, we have the incredible capacity to look with empathy, build a record of what must be seen, and weave a complex story from many strands. We may never see the world again as it is now. It is our duty to look at it closely. Thank you.